All right. So, welcome everyone to our BIPOC discussion. It's titled Under the Microscope Teaching Evaluation as a Person of Color. We have several guest speakers today. So, it's Jen Sims, Briauna Johnson, and then I'll be sharing a bit myself, Patricia Lara, if you don't recall. And I'll go ahead and allow others to introduce themselves. Jen, do you want to start us off?
Yes, of course. So, hi everyone. I'm Jen Sims. I'm a sociologist who researches race, ethnicity, social construction, perception, social psychology, and really interrogating how knowledge about race is produced and disseminated. I have written 4 books. My newest one, the little aqua one right above me, is called The Fallacies of Racism. I teach introduction to sociology, research methods, social sexuality, social race, all at the undergrad level. I am currently an associate professor at, but disclaimer, do not speak at all on behalf of the University of Alabama in Huntsville. My PhD is from Wisconsin. I also have a master's from Vanderbilt. I'm a runner. I did hurdles in grad school and high school and college. I did my first marathon last year. And I'm also a dance mom because I have an 11-year-old who is a pre-professional dancer, so she keeps me busy as well. So I'm really happy to be here and particularly have this discussion about teaching evaluations, given that I've taught in many different situations. They are kind of always an albatross, and so it's wonderful to have these discussions about them.
Thank you so much, Jen, and it's quite exciting. I just got the book, Fallacies of Racism, so I am looking forward to reading it. Brianna, would you share a bit about yourself as well, please?
Hello. So my name is Briauna Johnson. I teach at 2 institutions currently. So I teach primarily at California State University Northridge, which of course I'm speaking on my own behalf, do not represent. And I also teach at a local community college. I am a lecturer. I am at a Y3 status for Cal State University Northridge. I teach a plethora of courses, as most lecturers do. However, my main focus outside of teaching and also within teaching has a lot to do with Black feminist thought, Black queer theory, things of this nature. Diversity and social justice. I'm actually teaching courses on social justice this semester. I also teach research methods, sociology of education, so pretty widespread. On a more personal level, I too run, but not hurdles. I'm not tall enough. Uh, so I like to do half marathons, trail running, and I also do a lot of Spartan races. So that's me.
Thank you, Brianna. Lots of athleticism being displayed in our panel today. I'll also be sharing my experience as a community college instructor. So I teach courses. I tend to get pegged with the race and ethnicity classes, social problems, so all the fun ones that students love to debate you on. And then, of course, intro. I am not a runner, but I do love spin classes, so I guess that counts for something in cardio. So we'll go ahead and get started because we have about 5 questions, and then it'll be a free form of everyone partaking what they want to share. So the first question to pose is, what has been your experience with teaching evaluations?
I guess I'll kick us off and say that my experience across various types of institutions, so teaching at a community college, teaching as a graduate lecturer, teaching here at a research intensive university, has been one of emotional and false accusations. Students would say things like, everyone failed the first exam, that proves that she's a terrible instructor, and that's not true. Or they would say, she always blames everything on white men and she constantly talked about race. And then I go back and look at my lectures. I was like, this whole class was on social psychology or sexuality. Like, I mentioned race, yes, but I literally have like counted how many times I mentioned it. And I'm like, it's not always. So I would have these, and you could tell that they were emotional because sometimes there'd be capital, all caps, or there'd be exclamation points, or there'd be no punctuation or like misspellings that shows they're typing fast. And so it's like, these are emotional but false accusations. And so it feels like, particularly as a younger person of color, when I was first starting out teaching, that students were using these evals not to evaluate me, but as a complaint board, as a sounding board. If you really wanted to get some change, then I feel like you would have gone to the department chair or to the dean or proposed some solutions, which once or twice has happened. But they felt more like emotional false accusations, just a place to vent against perceived slights in the class, which, like I said, were actually not actually there.
I can also attest to that. I have had situations, mainly when I first started. Granted, I've only been teaching since 2018, but when I first started, I did notice a large, not large, I did notice some pattern of students that would say things like, I enjoyed the course. However, this was supposed to be a course on, whatever the topic, not a course on Black people. And I remember finding that kind of like, um, I remember looking, like you said, counting and seeing, okay, wait, what happened? Because I know for myself, one of the things that I do is I look at my roll sheet, I look at my student population, and I'm saying, okay, I have students that are coming from these different type of backgrounds. How can I incorporate these different types of backgrounds into my lecture, into my discipline, whatever? And so, yes, of course, I bring in Blackness, but I think that perhaps the messenger changes how people receive that information. And so, because the messenger is coming from a Black person, even though I talked about Latino experiences, I talked about Middle Eastern experiences, etc., the moment that I mentioned Black experiences, then there becomes this like lens of being hypercritical. Even myself, I feel like I have to kind of like skirt around how I say things because how people perceive that message. And so I think that I did find that, and it did kind of cause me pause there for a while. I'm growing out of that pause, but definitely initially it kind of was like, wait a minute, this can't be true. And it did feel alarming.
I appreciate what you both have been sharing. It sounds like a notice of like negative evaluations and then more challenge with identity related content is really emphasized within those student evaluations. For myself, as I mentioned, community college, the teaching evaluations, I think I also had a tendency of focusing on the negatives because not all the students would be like, oh, had been a terrible experience, but the ones that would make those all cap comments pertaining to like, oh, you're just attacking white people, and it's like, let me look back. Is it me? And so really feeling like I am not meeting the expectations of a professor, so having that doubt creep in. Tied to that also is these teaching evaluations, at least in the community college level, you have the student evals, you don't get to look at those until the end of the semester. And then you have your colleagues who are evaluating you. And so they are the ones who also are providing that evaluation. And I felt in my experience that I haven't been supported when it comes to like addressing what's being stated in the comments or ways that I've tried to counteract it. Because you're at my college, you're allowed to write a personal statement like, okay, what is your experience? What have you done to be the teacher you are today? And so most of the time it's just met with silence, or it's just met with like my latest evaluation in December. There were no positives. It was just like, oh, here's 2 more critiques to add to your plate of how you could improve as an instructor, which is really quite defeating. And so left me going into my winter break like, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So feeling belittled. So this leads to our next question. How do you address or respond to coded language or microaggressions in student evals or perhaps colleague evaluations? And how do you balance this with professional growth?
Okay, so I will start. I've addressed this in 2 ways. Well, the first of 3 ways actually. So the first way I addressed it when I first started getting these comments and realizing that they're not helpful. Like I said, a lot of them were just straight lies. Everyone didn't fail the first exam. Like I looked back at the the scores and saw, nope, that wasn't true. And so one ways that I did start addressing it was with humor. So I made this code sheet, and like it's on my academia.edu page for download, and it's just called Student Evaluations Decoded. And so the comment that Briauna had made where the student said, oh, she turned this into a class about race. Okay, that is decoded to mean you mentioned race one time in a class. It wasn't about race, right? And so if the comments were she's never in her office for office hours, it meant you weren't there that random Tuesday outside of office hours that particular student walked by. If they say that you're, inflexible, it really ought to mean that you can't do a right and a left split. But what it does mean is when they blew off the assignment, you refuse to give them multiple extensions, that is what inflexible really means. And so I made this like joke document and posted it online. And that just really cathartically helped me. People have downloaded it from academia.edu, have told me like, oh, haha, that was like so funny. And it's like, just kind of like, it gets to the point where they're using these for our evaluation. And it is so ridiculous because there's so much research that they are biased. And so bringing in that humor and making that kind of chart was the first thing that I kind of like did for myself. The next thing I did was I got a therapist who I went to twice a year with my evals in hand. And the whole reason I went was I would hand her my evals and then she would read them and then she would decode them. So she would read through, the negativity, and she'd read through the insults and try to pull out the nuggets that I might actually be able to use for some professional growth. So one thing she found was that I talk really fast, as you can hear me doing. I'll try to slow down, but I talk really fast. And I don't know how the students had phrased it in the evals, but she pulled that out and said, some students, it seems like you're talking really fast. They're having a difficult time with the material. So maybe if you could slow down. And so I started slowing down. I started pausing and saying like, are you guys ready to move on, and doing things like that. So I was able to kind of pull that out for professional growth, but I had to have her read it. She then ended up leaving, and that was sad. She moved on to a private practice and left. And so then I started flipping and switching with a colleague of mine, and she's in a whole different field. And so she would read mine while we were on the tenure track, and I would read hers. And then we would do that same function for each other of giving the feedback in a way that way I don't have to see those negative things about, myself. She doesn't have to see the negative things, but we try to kind of distill that down and translate it for each other. And then the last thing that I do now is I now confront them head on. So we just had our first days of classes here in Alabama, and I showed the students what I call the tale of two students. And it's two evaluations of me from the same semester. And in one, the student is praising the class activities that I do and the ways that the activities help the students to know what is expected of them on the out of class assignments and the exam. And in the particular day that I introduced this, it's not on syllabus day, it's after the first day of class. So students have just done this in-class activity. And so that student eval says, this is great. Everything we need to know for the exam and the assignments, we practiced in class. Everything was so transparent. And then the other evaluation from that same semester says she was the worst teacher ever. This class is awful. You have to teach yourself everything outside of class. She never tells you what she wants. She's such a hard grader. And I'm like, when you come to class, when you don't come to class. And so I kind of show students there that some students use evals to make these unfounded complaints. And I have found that that's kind of reduced some of those unfounded complaints as well, because I kind of showed them this is unfounded. You see for yourself, if you come here, then this is not what's kind of happening. So that kind of makes the students then think, well, if I'm going to say, I had a student once say that I was a terrible writer. That was a hilarious comment because it came the semester after I just won a book award for my second book. And so I was like, that's a little on the nose. But then showing the students those evaluations at the beginning of class kind of lets them see this may be what you're thinking, but the reason you're thinking she's a terrible writer, she's this, is probably because you haven't come to class and like done the activities. And so since I've done that, that's kind of helped address them and respond to them on that front end and not get as many on that back end.
As far as myself, I'm still working on what confrontation strategy I want to employ. I too also do things in jest. I haven't made a huge document about it, but I have addressed it sometimes in class, and like I think a lot of my lecture style is kind of conducive to my cultural style. So I do a lot of storytelling, calm response, anecdotal, stories, stuff like that. And so one part of my lecture when I'm teaching specifically research methods, when we talk about like biased samples and, unreliable data, sometimes bringing in things like evaluations can be quite interesting and kind of exploring that subject matter while also kind of confronting this issue on the other end. I've also tried to talk to colleagues, and here's the thing. When it comes to both campuses in which I work at, I am the only Black person in my department. Only. And though we do have other people of color, um, it doesn't, it's not the majority by any stretch, for one. And then for two, having the multitude of identities that I have, again, I am the only. And so sometimes even in the conversations with people that are my colleagues, trying to confront these issues with them, sometimes I don't want to say that it's only so much that they can fully understand or at least willing to understand. And so sometimes that leads to certain breakdowns that can become even more frustrating. One example is that, my most of my life, I have never been referred to as a colored person or colored. Um, Person of color, Black person, sure, of course. But never a colored person. That has a different connotation. And so it wasn't until I started teaching did numerous times students would refer to me as colored, literally every single semester, multiple times a semester. And I went to my colleagues and said, you know what? How is this possible that I'm getting a student who is a senior who is referring to Black people as colored, and you've had this student prior to? Why is it that I'm the only one, at least perception is that I'm the only one that is correcting them along the way? And one of my colleagues who happened to be a person of color, was not a Black person, but was a person of color, basically stated that I shouldn't correct them because it might make them feel like they weren't safe, and that we should just kind of prioritize that. And I was like, you do realize there's Black students in the classroom as well. And then, of course, my safety also matters. And so it became a situation where I didn't feel much support on that end. And so, I mean, I know it's getting a little bit away from evaluation, but that does carry on into evaluations as Patricia mentioned, we have our colleagues evaluate us as well. And so if you are the angry Black woman when you're discussing some topics, some of those stereotypes might bleed into their evaluation of you as well.
I appreciate what you both have shared. So I take notes while I'm listening because that's how I do it. So Jen, you mentioned 3 tactics that you utilize: humor, essentially finding those who can assist you, so like allies, whether a therapist or a fellow colleague, and then confronting head on. And then Brianna, you alluded to how humor is also something that you rely on, and also basing it upon like stories or personal examples that perhaps can allow students to better relate to some of the concepts, some of the thoughts that you are sharing in your classes. And then how you attempt to talk to colleagues to find those allies as well, but it can be difficult because they might not have a clear or lack the understanding of where you're coming from or what your experience. And so this could lead to what is noted as, I feel like, is isolation. So like when it comes to my community college, we are in California, but I am in a rural area that was predominantly red during the last election. And so I can try to get support from other faculty or from administration. And I learned very early on being here that there is no support. It's very much like, oh, well, maybe you should change this, or maybe you're lacking in this compartment, and it's not necessarily like other areas. So some ways that I've tried to be more head on. Humor is one way. I taught a workshop pertaining to like the significance of names and even pronunciation. And one student I prefer it this way, I guess, was blatantly like, well, it sounds like you're selfish if you care so much about someone pronouncing your name properly. And I'm like, well, it is my identity and I think it's significant. And I said, if people can pronounce Daenerys Targaryen from Game of Thrones, then they are capable of pronouncing my name, right? And so I try to make it into a joke, but also it's still a very serious subject and it's not selfish in itself. But it was interesting to hear that perspective. And then another example that just left me, which is unfortunate because I'm in the middle of talking, uh, pertains to like when I am sharing my experience or trying to address something that I encountered, I don't feel the support from my institution, but I try to implement it in my next class. So like if a student left a message that my 9-week course has too much information to cover, I have already like put a video at the beginning of the class, like this is a 9-week course. It's a short-term course because many of my students are first generation. So that's another factor for them. They don't, or they may not have the experience of like what is expected of them as a college student. So their frustration is not just a manifestation towards me, it's also just a manifestation of like the stress that they're encountering. So being more transparent and helping them out in that capacity is beneficial. And Brianna, I finally got it back. As you mentioned, I have also noticed in student submissions, people referring to others as being colored. And so I had to like because I teach a lot of predominantly online courses. I had to make annotations like, oh, this is not how you're supposed to refer to people. This is why, and here's an article, which I don't know if they ever read it, that gives more explanation for why this is significant. And in one of my evaluations, a student mentioned like it felt like they were putting me on the spot by mentioning that. It's like I don't think correcting or enlightening you on something is putting you on the spot. So it's interesting, like how perspective really can shift the narrative on many things. And so transitioning into our next question, how can institutions better support instructors of color when addressing bias in teaching evaluations?
So I just want to harpen back to something that you mentioned when you said that you can write like a statement with regards to your evaluations. And I know when you go up, when a person goes up for tenure, you have to write a tenure statement. You have to write a teaching statement along with your research statement. And then when you're applying for jobs, oftentimes they'll ask for a teaching statement along with evaluations and sample syllabi. But I think that one way the institutions could support instructors of color with these documents is by allowing us to respond directly to them. So I don't know about all universities. I've only ever been tenure track here, but at this university, we get evaluated annually. And after you submit your documents to be evaluated annually, your chair then submits their assessment of you. And if you think that something is wrong with that, you disagree with it, you don't think it's fair, you're allowed to directly respond. It goes into the record as well, but this is what the chair says. So say the chair ranks you as, meets expectations. And you're like, no, I exceeded them last year. Like you told me to do XYZ. I did, A, B, C, D and XYZ. And so you're allowed to respond back to that. We're not allowed to respond back to student evaluations. And I found that out the hard way because I took the liberty of doing it. And then when they saw that I did that, they were like, cease and desist and don't do that again. But it was my very first year here when I was tenure track. I came from a full-time adjunct position where I was not tenure track. And so here, the evals were obviously going to go into my file that would decide if I got tenure. And so for my first semester here, I annotated them. I went through and I found where someone had said that year it was the first paper, not the first exam. And they said, everybody failed the first. So I went through and said, nope, everybody did not fail the first paper. The breakdown of grades is XYZ for the first paper. Or in intro, they said, she talked about race every class period. I went back, just like Brianna said she did, looked and saw, nope, I talked about race in about 40% of the class, which is fine for introduction to sociology. That tracks with how much it's in the book. And so I went back and made in we get our evals in a PDF, and I used the comment feature in Adobe and annotated the evals. And I was told to cease and desist and stop being so overly sensitive about negative comments, but how to address lies that could derail my tenure case was not actually brought up. Basically, they were saying, do not respond to this and not even just negativity, but outright misrepresentations of your teaching. And I feel like one way institutions could support us is allow us to respond, allow us to have that on the record to show that if you're going to still use these documents, even though we know that they are biased, we know that they're not very effective, if you're going to use them anyway, the least you can do is allow us to respond to them and point out the inconsistencies. But at least here, we're not allowed to respond.
I know we're allowed to respond to our colleagues. I do not know if we're allowed to respond to our students. I haven't tried it. But that would be an interesting, and I think it would be helpful and beneficial. I agree. I also think that, I was reading some of the articles that you, Patricia, that you sent. And one of the things that I found really interesting was kind of like this conservative, I can't remember the exact terminology, but it was like the conservative angle of like diversity. And I feel like a lot of institutions have that. They have like the little flyers with like the 3 POCs on there, and they're like, we're diverse, right? But they don't do anything beyond that. And I notice sometimes when I'm doing like evaluation and when I'm doing just like hiring processes, they ask a lot of questions about your familiarity with working in with a diverse population, but specifically they're looking at the student body, which of course is important. But they do not talk about your experience and in what capacity of experience you have with working with diverse colleagues. And I think those are very, very interesting dynamics, because when you're in a position of professor, sometimes there's a hierarchy when it comes to students, a power dynamic, and those power dynamics sometimes still float into this relationships as colleagues, which is supposed to be more on an even ground. And so having some more emphasis on that, also having what I notice sometimes is whenever there is, how do I put this with keeping my job? So like what I notice sometimes is when there is a emphasis on diversity in institutions, it sometimes, and not with everyone, but sometimes comes across as a white savior complex. And a lot of this like white liberal discourse, and addressing that in academia, I think, is essential to having real inclusion. Not, I remember I gave this one in my diversity and social justice class. I do a activity that has to do with recipes, and basically we create a cookbook based off of our different cultural traditions and things of this nature. And I wanted to do something that was highlighting those cultural traditions that has absolutely nothing to do with white people, and also has something that is a positive, a celebration of these identities. And I feel like sometimes in institutions and academia, specifically in sociology, whenever race is mentioned in classrooms, in discussion, it's mentioned in the proximity or relationship to whiteness, and it's also mentioned in a negative. We're seen in chains first, and what that does to you psychologically when the first time you see yourself on a page is in chains, what that might mean for those students. And so addressing that differently. And then I would also mention again, what experience do you have working with colleagues? I think sometimes our process as far as our hierarchy within even the professorship, so it kind of keeps certain groups elevated. I can say so for at my institution. Yes, they are starting to hire more people of color. However, we're starting at the bottom tier. We're losing enrollment. And so those at the top tier, the ones that have the identities that represent what academia has represented for eons, are the ones that are securing courses. They're the ones that are securing funds. They're the ones that are securing grants. Whereas the ones that are just now entering into academia that tend to represent people of color, women, queer folks, we're getting pushed out, pushed out, pushed out, and sacrificed. And so if institutions addressed that as well, it's almost like an indirect way of having a caste system where certain groups remain in this elevation where other groups are still fighting for resources. These groups just so happen to be predominantly people of color.
So thank you both for what you've shared. It definitely, because Brianna, you're the last one I heard, these different spheres of power are definitely manifesting, and I think it's even being reflected with the political system, right? One of the questions that, because I'm friends with many people who are adjuncts, is I'm not going to be able to find a job in the next coming years. And those people who have power at the moment, they're kind of secure relatively in comparison to them. So when it comes to how institutions can address some of these shortcomings that we've noticed, I feel like it goes beyond just the evaluation at times. For example, with myself, I think the term you were referring to from the article, Brianna, was the Benetton model, which I thought was really interesting. Essentially, it's where institutions recruit individuals who foster an image of harmonious plurality while authority remains concentrated among dominant group members, which I also thought was interesting because having been hired at my institution, I sometimes feel like this sense of, the term left me, but the sense of that I don't fit in. I was just a tokenism. There we go. Tokenism, where I was just put into this place because I fit certain check marks, but my experiences or my perspectives isn't really taken into account. It's still the same process that they've had in previous years. And so that could be frustrating. And so at an institutional level, when it comes to like applying it to my own example, students, as I mentioned, many of them are first generation, many of them are low income. They go into our institution and our courses are predominantly 9 weeks long, which is very fast paced. Especially for me, I came from a semester system, so I had to adjust to a quarter system as well. And what I've noticed is that there is a lack of familiarity with managing your time efficiently, with having developed the writing skills. And so as an instructor, I am responsible for not only endowing them with the knowledge of sociology, which can be frustrating to some students or just completely unfamiliar for them, but then I also have to be sure that they're getting caught up on being able to write an essay, being able to manage their time, because it's not just a discussion they have to do a quiz by the end of the week as well. And when it comes to support from the institution, we don't have any. We used to have an early alert system, and I learned that that was a lie because I would send like, this student needs additional support. And then at the end of the semester, they're like, oh, none of those alerts went to anyone, because no one is directly like manning this system. So a lot of these students were left in the dark, like, oh, sink or swim kind of mentality. And that will obviously lead them to feel like they're not capable of proceeding forward if they didn't get the support, if they were just left alone throughout the 9 weeks, not just in my class, but the other classes that they took. As was mentioned by Jen and Brianna, we are allowed to respond to what our evaluation was in totality. I've never directly addressed what students wrote, but I do read it, and then I write it in my personal feedback, alluding to like this past evaluation. I alluded to how to various studies about how women of color who are in instructor are faced with much more harsher criticism. Interesting enough, like one of the critiques I had is I wasn't as accommodating as I should have been. And I think this comes to like the gender role that's often perceived, like I'm supposed to be more nurturing because of my gender. And so having to adjust that, because it's also been a comment made by colleagues like, oh, you said that you're not going to accept a late assignment, I don't know, after a week. It seems too harsh. Could you like make it nicer so that they don't feel like you're not supporting them? It's like, but okay. So having to adjust my tone when it comes to certain contexts or situations that I have to deal with. And I feel like that shouldn't be the focus point. It's more so like an institutional need that needs to be addressed, because I'm limited by the 9 weeks, right? So if I extend a week, it's like, oh, okay, well now they only have 8 weeks, but then they have more. It just piles on for them, and so just thoughts on there. Next question. What lessons have you learned about using teaching evaluations as a tool for improvement while also recognizing their limitation?
I'll go first for this one because I'm pretty sure my answer is going to be a bit different than other folks. My answer is that I really rely on use teaching evaluations for improvement. I do not find them to be a document that is about improvement. The improvement that I've gotten from students, or the feedback I've gotten from students that have led to the best improvement, has been verbally to me or in an email to me. It has never been in these anonymous after the semester evals where people just want to complain because they didn't get the grade that they wanted or kind of whatever. But students who've had genuine feedback on the class have given that to me person to person or in an email after the class. Hey, I just wanted to follow up and say this particular, thing. And I've gotten great feedback that way that's really kind of helped me. In particular, I started teaching, and I can't believe I'm about to say this, 20 years ago. And so particularly as my students have changed from being my fellow millennials to being Gen Z, as that shift has occurred, obviously there's all these jokes about generations, but the students really do kind of respond to activities better, respond to prompts better, respond to videos that have pop culture references that now this generation doesn't get because it was from the late 90s. And so as that shift has occurred, I've occasionally had students who would tell me either in class, after class, in an email, but not on evals. They would tell me themselves, hey, this wasn't really hitting right for, our age, or like we didn't really get this. And I've used that to improve. But student evaluations, the way they are right now, are not about improvement. They're not called, student feedback. They're not called improvement assessment. They're called student evaluations. They're basically, in my view, a customer service satisfaction tool, which if we need to take customer service satisfaction, like because we need that data and we want to do pre and post, like, okay, I can understand that. But we need to understand, and we being not just individual professors, so that we don't internalize the comments, the negative comments, the unfair comments, but the institutions really need to start understanding that these are not designed to help us improve. That is not designed to help us improve. And so we could either design something that does actually help us improve, that would be great, or recognize these for what they are. They are student satisfaction surveys. We can use that to figure out what would be the satisfaction, but to, okay, students want more online classes, students want more extra credit, students want more whatever. Okay, great. But that's actually not about us improving our pedagogy as instructors. Student evaluations, as they are now, does not help with that. So I haven't learned any lessons about using them for my improvement. I've gotten my improvement from, workshops such as this when I was a younger professor, from reading books about pedagogy and teaching, from asking out, senior people on campus, hey, can we get a coffee and can I talk to you about this issue that I'm having in class? That's where I learned and improved, and was able to have that professional development, not from student evals.
I actually second a lot of what Jen said. I had to learn to contextualize. So initially, my very, very first teaching evaluation, I was just like, like, what do you mean? And I felt like very down on myself, and like I internalized, and it turned into this like unhealthy imposter syndrome and unhealthy perfectionism, people pleasing, etc. And then I learned more about like emotional labor and all of these different things, and I'm like, oh, you're putting on your shoulders things that aren't yours. And I was socialized to do so, specifically as a woman of color. And so I had to remember that everything has to be taken into context. What are some of the things that I can say, okay, yeah, that's valid. I can take that and actually use something with that. And um, what things I need to say, that is not on me. That is not a reflection of me. You can, only do so much. That has been something that I had to keep and still, present tense, reminding myself. Um, if I show up prepared, I do my best. If I'm able to lay down at night and be like, "Yep, you did that," then I can feel confident in myself, and I rely less on external evaluations, and more on how I internally process it, while still validating the things that I can say, okay, yes, that's valid. I can see where that's coming from. So, like Jen, earlier you mentioned how your therapist said that you talk too fast, and I have been told that, and so that has been something that I was like, okay, you know what, valid, let me work on that. And now I even implement more questions and stuff like that, just to slow myself down, but also to make it so that other people are talking, and so I have found validity in some things, but I also was able to understand, as is everything in life, you have to take it into context, um prior to trying to internalize and reflect on who you are.
Um, I believe to an extent I'm similar. As was mentioned, I tend to internalize what was noted in the eval. Like the past December, I got the evaluation and I was pretty down about it for a week, feeling like I'm not, meeting expectations. And then talking to not colleagues but people who are outside of my field but are still like in the field of education, and them sharing also their trials and tribulations when it comes to evaluations. And so this past evaluation, as I mentioned, some of the comments from students weren't the most uplifting, and then just add on two more critiques from my colleagues, but there was no mention of like positive aspects that I'm doing. And so what's helped me is seeking support from external sources. So like I will go attend professional development on my own outside of the institution. And there's where I get comment from fellow people in the field who are like, oh, we really like this activity you did. And I was like, oh, okay. So like something that is being viewed in a positive manner. One thing I've taken more so from evaluations is like how to have a defensive position, because oftentimes when I'm being evaluated, I have to defend myself. For example, one of the critiques I received in this latest evaluation is in my in-person class, I handed back feedback from assignments that students submitted, and I left it on the desk for them to collect. And they're like, you shouldn't do that because now students have access to other students' grades. And I had to quickly defend myself and say, well, the grade's not on the paper, it's on Canvas. That's just their qualitative, their written feedback, so that they have a better understanding of why did I get this numerical score on this other end. And so really it wasn't an area for support. It was more like I'm going into a battleground and I have to provide rationale for why I do certain things, because I feel like I'm much more under a telescope when I'm in that situation. One thing I have found beneficial, similar to what both of you said, is observing or reflecting on how class sessions have gone. So this is easier to do in in-person classes. Our institution struggles getting the numbers for in-person. So right now I'm teaching an 8-student in-person class, which is very small. So most of our classes are online. So I offer my own midpoint checks. And this allows me to get insight on like, what are students enjoying? What are some aspects they might be struggling in? I even phrase some of the questions like a 3-2-1, like what are 3 things you learn, 2 things you still want to learn, 1 suggestion, etc. And I think that gives me more insight than the evaluations that are done through the institution itself. So this could lead us to our final question that we have designed is if you could redesign the teaching evaluation process to make it more equitable for instructors of color, what changes would you propose?
I've got a super quick change that literally could be implemented in 5 seconds if an institution would take this into account. Do the evals a month later. I don't know, every university that I've been in, the evals come out right before finals. So like during the end of the semester, meaning they're coming out as students are very stressed out, very emotional, about to go into finals, assuming they're going to fail if they get anything less than 100. And so they're already not in a good headspace. And now you're asking them to evaluate us. And this is why it seems like they're just so complaint filled and just misperceptions about what's failed and what's been terrible. And so often then I've got, the students, the evals make it seem like the class is terrible, it's horrible, and then they end up doing well. A friend of mine is in chemistry, and they have to take these standardized exams. I forget what they're called, American Chemical Society Association, something like that. And they have these standardized exams, and her eval scores for her department are like the lowest, but her students always score highest on those end of the semester exams. So like maybe wait until a month out of the class. So like in the chemistry example, you would not evaluate until after you see, oh wait, yeah, actually that class was hard, but look at this, you passed that standardized exam and better and with a higher score than some other people. Wait until a month out, because particularly for sociology, students learn things and then it's that next big event that happens. And it's our country. There's going to be another big event that happens very soon. So just wait 1 month out and there'll be some big event that happens and they'll have something triggered like, oh, we learned about that, blah, blah, blah. Now it's a month out. Now send in the evaluation. And now that you're not stressed out for finals, you're not freaking out that you're not going to graduate. It's not either the holidays. And so you're already freaked out about that and stressed out. It's not right going into summer. If we sent it a month later, I feel like that would really calm the complaints down. I started doing that kind of just on my own. I do not allow students to contest their grades until after they've read their feedback. So you see the grade put into Canvas, but no, you can't start emailing me saying, why did I get this grade? Why didn't I get that? Until you get that feedback that you talked about. Once you get that and you look over that, then you may contest the grade. And the number of students that I've had contesting grades has dropped to almost zero. It's maybe 1 or 2 a year since I just started being like, wait till you read your feedback, then contest the grade. But it's that emotional immediacy that I feel like is not the only reason. Obviously, people are still biased and, there's the perceptions and all of that. But that emotional immediacy is something very quickly we could take out. Just wait and send the emails for 1 month. And I would, bet not too much money. I still have student loans, but I would bet a little bit of money that evals would improve for people of color if we just wait. And then another thing is like a month out, are you really still mad that, they made that offhand comment in class? Do you even still really remember that? Like, do you even remember a month out, emotions are down, things are better in perspective. And so it wouldn't solve everything because racism, sexism, nativism, all of that still exists. But I feel like if you made students wait a month and then do the eval, I feel like the unhelpful parts, the good things are still going to be there. The good critiques are still going to be there if they're in there. But I feel like a bunch of those knee-jerk emotional reactions would not be there if we just waited a month.
That's an awesome solution. I haven't even thought about that. So I really like that. I would also say, I don't know who, and I'm sure every institution is different, who gets to be placed in the position of being an evaluator or reviewing some of these evaluations. But and I don't know what processes they go through, but it could be, if this isn't already implemented, helpful if whomever is in this position of power to review these evaluations and things of this nature, if they also had a very, very curated training on the biases behind these evaluations, some of the data that has been presented about these evaluations. And in the same way that I am consuming my evaluations via context, they also do the same thing because they have the training to do so. And so kind of implementing some more of that knowledge for the evaluators themselves to be like, okay, I'm going to look at these evaluations, pay attention to the things that are valid, pay attention to the things that may be more of a reflection of biases, maybe a reflection of just your everyday complaint type of stuff, and being able to be trained more on how to decipher that, not put all your eggs in that basket. I think unfortunately, academia is turning into, I like the way that you mentioned, Jen, a satisfaction survey, because it does feel like the customer's always right. And being able to kind of distance ourselves from that customer's always right, we just need that dollar to be sitting in our seats, mentality would make a huge difference.
I'm not sure what type of redesign would be beneficial. Like for our institution, we have some autonomy. You could choose between week 2 or week 7 to be evaluated. But whatever week you choose, that's when the colleague or evaluator is going to come into your classroom, observe you, and then also hand out. We get paper. If it's an in-person class, we get paper copies. If it's an online class, it's surveys. So the issue with surveys is students aren't really sure what the survey is for. Really, they're just like, here is a survey about your instructor and go. And some of the questions, I feel like if you give students background, not to make it a bias assessment, but they don't understand what it means. Like, does your instructor have a lot of contact with you on a weekly basis? What does contact mean? Oh, it could entail the Canvas message, the gradebook. And so not having understanding of what kind of what's being asked in these questions, so maybe giving the students insight pertaining to it, or allowing them the opportunity to reflect openly rather than just like a quantitative, like a 1 through 5. And what does that represent when it comes to the evaluation process? The other thing that I thought of when Brianna was sharing, and again, it has left me, maybe it'll come to me. It's not going to come to me. I think one of the things that I felt was unfair is that when I had my final meeting for my evaluation, my evaluators are supposed to start like, okay, what did they not like? What did they like? And it was very obvious to me that, or at least it seemed that way to me, that my evaluators had not read anything of my evaluation, like my own self statement or what students have written, because they had nothing much to share. They're like, oh, do you want to highlight things that you particularly want to emphasize in this meeting? And that felt like, oh, you're putting it on, you didn't take the time to read and prepare for this evaluation. So it's kind of just winging it. And I feel like, I don't know what the process is on their end, but maybe if it was like a more like, okay, provide your own feedback prior to the meeting so that I'm not the one who has to lead it when I'm the one being evaluated. But again, I don't have the insight on their end of the things. Okay, so those were all of our questions for our panel. We got it under time, but Brianna, Jen, thank you so much for attending and sharing your insight. Do you want to share anything more?
Yeah, I just want to address Dr. Mustafa, and I hope I pronounced their name correctly's comment or question in the chat. It's not to the same extent. I've never had someone say the accent is too thick in my evals, but I have had students when I was in Wisconsin say that I have, a Southern accent, and that was, difficult to understand, or like ask me to repeat words. And, as a Southerner, I'm used to having my accent made fun of. And so one thing that I did when I realized that that was, going to happen was I would just say that at the beginning of class, like, okay, I am from the South. Yes, I have a Southern accent. If I talk fast or get upset or get excited, it's going to come out even more. And I would just say, if you can't understand a particular word that I said, or if this doesn't make sense, just ask me and I'll ask you to repeat it. And then I would put it back on them and remind them, this is my first time in the Midwest. You'd saying, don't you know, I don't know what that means. So I might need to ask you to say some things again as well. So I understand that as a native speaker, as a native accent, even though it is a stigmatized one, it's not the same as a different language potentially accent. And obviously I don't have the visual of being a woman in a hijab, but I would just straight up mention the accent thing to them. And then also, particularly my upper level classes, I point out how learning to listen to your language with various accents is going to be very advantageous in your future job, because you may have to work with someone who is from my region or who speaks in my particular language. Like, I have to learn to hear from you guys in order to be a fair professor. This is going to be your training, and learning to hear English from someone who has an accent different than you. That's going to help make you a better employer, also just better person in my view, but definitely we'll look at it from the employee's perspective. That'll help make you a better employee. And so that's what I would say to them up front. And again, not going to bet too much money because I haven't had my student loans forgiven yet, but I would bet a little bit that perhaps if you address it on the front end, then at least they'll feel a bit too neutered on the back end to make that exact same complaint that you just told them about at the beginning. And so then that might kind of help cut down on that.
All right. Thank you, Jen, for addressing Mustafa's question. I'm seeing if there's any leftover questions people want to ask. But as I mentioned, our Wednesday wrap-up next week at 12 p.m. is the opportunity to ask any follow-up questions for people who attended this session or who are going to watch the recording and then pose their questions for next week. So thank you so much to the both of you for attending, and I hope you're able to make our Wednesday wrap-up session next week as well.
I'll just pipe in and say thank you as well for modeling resilience and fortitude and brilliance in terms of how to navigate. We all have sort of our own sort of toolkit, and it's really nice to hear from others. I think it's very affirming to also know that we've had very similar experiences, and it's very much it's not me, it's not you, it's the system, right? And so yeah, just wonderful. Thanks so much for sharing. Thank you, Patricia, all of you.